The kettle whistled in the kitchen, but Harold Whitaker didn't move right away. He sat in his worn armchair by the window, hands resting on his knees, staring out at the still Wyoming morning. Snow dusted the edges of the pine trees that lined his back pasture, and a solitary raven perched on the old fence post, calling into the quiet. The kettle kept whistling. With a sigh, Harold pushed himself up and shuffled to the stove. He poured 2 cups of tea, just like he had for the last 49 years. One went into his favorite chipped blue mug, the other into a delicate porcelain cup with painted violets, the one Eileen always used. He set both cups on the table out of habit, then paused. The other chair was empty. He stared at it for a long moment. Then, slowly, he picked up the violet cup and returned it gently to the cabinet. He sat down alone. It had been 6 months since Eileen passed, but in many ways, Harold still lived in the world they had shared. Her scarf still hung neatly by the door. Her recipe box, filled with her perfect cursive handwriting, sat on the kitchen counter like it was waiting to be used. He hadn't had the heart to move any of it. Some days, he still reached for her hand while watching the sunset. The days blurred together now. He ate when he remembered to. Slept when he could. Time, once marked by shared laughter and grocery lists, had turned vague and pointless. His children called from out of state, good kids, really, but their voices seemed to come from a different planet. They talked about office parties, flight delays, baby showers. Things Harold could no longer connect with. He still walked to the mailbox every morning. It wasn't far, just down the gravel drive. The neighbors had long since stopped sending Christmas cards, but the routine gave him purpose. He'd stop by Eileen's garden on the way back. Her roses had been the talk of the neighborhood once. Now they stood brittle and bare under the frost. On Thursdays, he visited the cemetery. It was a quiet place up on a hill, overlooking the town. He always brought her favorite flowers, white lilies if he could find them, and sat beside her gravestone with a thermos of tea. He'd talk to her about nothing and everything, the weather, the ache in his hip, the birds nesting in the old chimney. No one else saw it, but Harold was shrinking, not in height, but in spirit. The days stretched out before him, long and colorless. He had done his part, loved his wife, raised his family, served his town. Now, he wasn't sure what was left. He wasn't depressed, exactly. Just untethered. And on this particular morning, as he sipped his tea and stared at the steam rising from the empty cup across from him, he muttered aloud, "I'm still here, Eileen. But I don't know why." It was on a Tuesday that Harold found himself in town, though he couldn't quite remember why. Probably something mundane, eggs, light bulbs, maybe another pair of reading glasses to replace the ones he kept misplacing. The streets of Buffalo, Wyoming, were quiet that morning. A thin sheet of frost covered the sidewalks, and a gentle wind carried the scent of pine and wood smoke through the air. He wandered through the aisles of Dawson's General Store, taking his time. That was the nice thing about being retired. No one expected him to hurry anymore. He stood in front of the pet food section, gazing blankly at bags of kibble and canned tuna for cats. He wasn't sure how he'd ended up in that aisle. Maybe he just missed the sound of paws on the floor. Looking for something special, a voice asked behind him, light and kind, with a touch of mischief. Harold turned. Standing there was a woman in her 60s, short and round-faced, her silver hair pulled into a tidy bun under a knit hat. Her shopping cart was half filled with blankets and peanut butter jars. "No," Harold replied with a faint smile. "Just looking." She didn't move. "That's good kibble, that one there," she said, pointing at a purple bag. "Though I imagine you're not buying it for yourself." Harold chuckled softly. Not unless I run out of oatmeal. She laughed, then extended a gloved hand. Connie Bell. I run Pine Valley Animal Rescue, just east of here. Out by the old sawmill, if you know it. I know the road, he said, shaking her hand. Harold Whitaker. Connie gave him a long, knowing look. You strike me as a man who could use some company, of the furry variety. Harold raised a brow. Do I now? I've got more dogs than chew toys and not enough hands to walk them all, she said, her voice light, but there was something real in her eyes. We get old, Mr. Whitaker, but dogs don't care how slow you move. They're just glad you showed up. He didn't answer. Not at first. She gave him a gentle smile, like someone who understood more than she let on. No pressure. Just think about it. As she turned to walk away, she paused and looked back. I'm there every day except Sunday. You ever feel like talking to someone who won't interrupt, come on by. That night, back at home, Harold sat in his chair by the window with a blanket over his knees. The wind howled outside, and somewhere in the walls, the old pipes groaned. He reached for the bookshelf and pulled out a thin, worn journal, Eileen's gardening diary. He opened to a page dated 12 years ago. Her handwriting looped neatly across the paper. Harold's heart is soft as butter when it comes to animals. I hope someday, when he's older, he finds comfort in them. They always seem to understand him. Harold stared at the words for a long time. The next morning, he put on his boots, picked up a box of biscuits from Dawson's, and drove out toward the old sawmill. He didn't know what he was looking for exactly. But something told him he might just find it. The gravel crunched beneath Harold's boots as he pulled up to Pine Valley Animal Rescue. It wasn't much to look at, a low-slung building with faded siding and a crooked wooden sign that read Pine Valley in hand-painted green letters. Snow sat heavy on the roof, and the wind tugged at the old flag hanging by the door. But the place felt alive, even before he stepped inside. A bell jingled above the door as he entered, and the smell hit him, equal parts pine cleaner, hay, and something distinctly dog. The warmth of the space surprised him. Not just the heater humming in the corner, but something more, like the place was used to being full of heartbeats. Back again already? Connie called from behind the front desk, looking up from a stack of forms. She was wearing a puffy vest over a wool sweater, her reading glasses perched halfway down her nose. Didn't say I was coming, Harold replied. She grinned. Didn't have to. She waved him through a swinging gate and down a corridor lined with kennels. As they walked, the sound of tails thumping against metal doors echoed like a drumline. I want you to meet the gang, Connie said, her voice full of pride. Each one's got a story. Most folks don't ask for it, but I think you might be the type who wants to know. First was Maggie, a golden retriever with 3 legs and fur like spun honey. She was sitting upright, wagging her tail slowly, her eyes calm and wise. Lost her leg to a tractor accident, Connie said. You won't find a sweeter dog on God's green earth. Then came Pickles, a Maine Coon cat the size of a watermelon, lounging on a heat pad like she owned the place. One I was missing, but the remaining one gleamed with mischief. She runs this joint, Connie whispered like it was classified information. In the next kennel was Franklin, a middle-aged beagle with a pudgy belly and a mournful face. He howls in his sleep, Connie said, chuckling. Sounds like a blues singer. Harold nodded politely at each animal, unsure what he was supposed to feel. But when they reached the last kennel, something shifted. Inside lay a large, shaggy dog, Socks, a young border collie mix, black with white paws. He was chewing on the corner of a mop head, eyes bright with mischief. Trouble, this one, Connie said. Smart as a whip, fast as a fox, and always in someone's business. As they stood there, Socks suddenly lunged forward and grabbed one of Harold's bootlaces, tugging it loose. Harold stumbled back. "Hey now!" Connie laughed. "He likes you." Harold looked down at the tangled mess around his ankle, then back at the dog's wagging tail. "I haven't had my shoes stolen since my grandson was 3, he muttered. "Well," Connie said with a smile, "maybe it's time someone shook you up again." And in that moment, surrounded by wagging tails, blinking eyes, and the soft hum of breath in warm air, Harold felt it. A flicker of something he hadn't felt in months. Belonging. Harold wasn't sure what he expected on his first real day at the shelter, but he certainly hadn't imagined getting dragged through a puddle by a dog named Socks before 9 a.m. It had snowed lightly the night before, just enough to make everything slippery. Socks, eager and full of whatever energy border collies were made of, had been bouncing like a coiled spring since Harold walked through the door. Against Connie's advice, Harold had offered to walk him. It started fine. Then Socks spotted a squirrel. And Harold found himself skidding across the icy gravel, clinging to the leash with all the dignity a 76-year-old man could muster. Back inside, Connie handed him a towel and tried, politely, not to laugh. "You've got the makings of a real dog whisperer," she said, eyes twinkling. He muttered something under his breath and wiped his glasses. Later that morning, he was assigned to feed the cats. That went smoothly until he accidentally gave the finicky Maine Coon, Pickles, a scoop of dog food. She took it as a personal insult and knocked the bowl off the counter in protest. Harold spent the next 10 minutes apologizing to a one-eyed cat, while she sat on top of the fridge, glaring like royalty. He tried sweeping the back corridor next, only to have Maggie, the 3-legged golden retriever, follow him with gentle persistence, nosing at his side until he gave up and sat on the floor beside her. She laid her head on his lap. For 15 quiet minutes, they didn't move. There were other moments too, some funny, some frustrating. Franklin the beagle barked every time Harold opened the supply closet, as if sounding an alarm. A small mutt named Jellybean took a liking to his shoelaces. Socks, predictably, chewed a hole clean through his left glove. By lunchtime, Harold's knees ached, his back felt like it was made of gravel, and his sweater was covered in cat hair. But he was smiling. He sat at a folding table in the staff room, sipping black coffee from a paper cup. Outside the window, the snow had started again, soft and slow, like falling feathers. In the kennel room behind him, the animals rustled, snored, purred, and scratched. "You holding up all right?" Connie asked, poking her head in. "I've survived worse," he said. "Namely, helping Eileen host Thanksgiving in '87. She laughed. "Sounds like you're starting to find your rhythm." Harold looked down at his coffee. "It's different. But it feels good. Useful, even." Connie nodded. "That's the secret, isn't it? Animals don't care who you used to be. They just care that you're here now." He sat with that for a moment. Later, as he was leaving, Socks ran up again, leash dragging behind him, tail wagging like a flag in the wind. He dropped a half-chewed tennis ball at Harold's feet. Harold bent down slowly, picked it up, and gave it a thoughtful toss. The dog bounded after it like his life depended on it. "Well," Harold muttered to himself, watching him go, "I suppose this is what starting over looks like." The first time Harold saw Bear, he thought the dog might have been carved from stone. He was lying in the far back kennel, motionless except for the slow rise and fall of his chest. A hulking Bernese Mountain Dog, Bear had a thick coat of black fur with rust-colored patches above his eyes and white running down his chest and snout like spilled milk. But there was no spark in him, just a quiet stillness, like a house with all the lights turned off. "He hasn't eaten in 2 days," Connie said softly as they stood outside the kennel. "Family left him when they moved to Texas. Said they couldn't take a senior dog into an apartment." Harold looked at the dog for a long moment. Bear's eyes didn't even flicker. "He giving up?" "I think he already did," Connie replied. "We've tried treats, attention, even other dogs. Nothing reaches him." Without saying much, Harold pulled a folding chair from the corner and sat down outside the kennel door. "I'll stay a while." Connie glanced at him. "You don't have to." "I know." And so he did. Every morning, after cleaning duties, Harold brought his thermos and a book and sat near Bear's kennel. He didn't talk much at first, just sipped his coffee and read aloud. Sometimes it was the newspaper. Sometimes it was Eileen's old gardening journal. April 12th, he read one day, "Planted dahlias near the shed." Harold said, "It's too early, but I've never listened to calendars when it comes to hope." Still, Bear didn't move. But Harold kept showing up. One morning, it was especially cold. The kind of cold that seeps into your bones. Harold arrived bundled in an old wool coat, holding a blanket tucked under his arm. He didn't speak right away. Just sat and watched the steam rise from his coffee. Then, with a soft grunt, Bear lifted his head. Only for a second, but it was enough. Harold blinked. "Well, would you look at that," he murmured. The next day, Bear shifted again, this time lifting his head and watching as Harold read. A day later, Harold slid the blanket under the kennel bars. Bear sniffed it, then pulled it toward him with one paw and curled around it like it was something precious. After a week, Bear met him at the kennel door. Not with excitement. Not with a tail wag. But with presence. Harold opened the latch and stepped in, slowly, cautiously. Bear didn't back away. He knelt down and held out a hand. "I know how it feels," he whispered. "To think the best part of your life is already gone." Bear moved closer. Rested his large head against Harold's knee. Harold swallowed hard. That night, he sat in his armchair by the window, holding a photo of Eileen and whispering, "I met someone today." He's quiet. But he listens. And for the first time in months, the house didn't feel quite so empty. The days began to slip into a quiet rhythm. Harold would rise early, just as he had for most of his life, brew a strong pot of coffee, and drive out to Pine Valley before the frost had a chance to melt. He wasn't there just for the animals anymore, he was part of the place now. Part of its routine, its noise, its warmth. Connie gave him more responsibility, though she always acted like it was just a favor to her, not something as serious as purpose. One morning, she caught him organizing the supply room by alphabet. "I'm guessing retirement didn't give you enough to alphabetize," she teased. Harold chuckled. Never trusted a room that doesn't have its cans in order. But beyond the light chores and the steady presence of Bear at his side, something more began to happen, something Harold hadn't expected. He started to laugh again. At Franklin's mournful howls whenever someone opened a cupboard. At Sock's habit of stealing every left glove he could find. Even at Pickles, who once proudly dropped a dead mouse onto Harold's lap like a gift from royalty. Children from the elementary school started visiting the shelter every other Friday, part of a reading program Connie had organized. They'd gather in the front room, each child sitting cross-legged on a mat with a book, a dog, or cat curled nearby. The animals calmed the kids. The kids brought a sparkle back to the animals. And Harold? He was their storyteller. At first, he just listened. Then one Friday, a boy named Benny tugged on his sleeve. "Mr. Harold, can you read it? You do the voices better." He hesitated, but then took the book, cleared his throat, and gave his best grumbly bear impression. The kids roared with laughter. Even Pickles, curled in the corner, seemed to purr with approval. Soon, it became a tradition. Story hour with Mr. Harold. Connie even printed a sign for it. He pretended to grumble about the attention, but secretly, it thrilled him. People were beginning to look forward to seeing him. Not because he was someone's grandfather or someone's husband, but because he was Harold. One chilly afternoon, after cleaning out Maggie's kennel and brushing her thick coat, Harold sat beside Bear and whispered, "I think I forgot I had anything left to give." Bear looked up, eyes gentle and understanding. That night, Harold sat at his kitchen table, surrounded by open letters and crayon drawings, thank you notes from the kids. One drawing showed Harold sitting in a rocking chair, a group of animals at his feet, a book in his lap, and a giant brown and white dog beside him. A child had written in large letters, "Mr. Harold has the best stories. He makes the dogs happy." He ran a hand over the paper, his fingers resting on the drawn image of Bear. He didn't speak aloud, not that night. But in the stillness of the room, for the first time in a long while, Harold didn't feel alone. He felt home. It began as a whisper on the wind, a shift in the air, the kind of cold that came not from temperature but from silence. By mid-afternoon, the clouds had thickened, settling low over the town like a heavy wool blanket. The snow came sideways, carried by a wind that howled like a freight train. In Wyoming, late spring could be a trickster, and this storm rolled in with all the weight of winter. Harold was just finishing his afternoon rounds at Pine Valley when the lights flickered once, then again, and then everything went dark. Connie stood in the office, flashlight in hand, frowning at the old fuse box. "Power's out all over town," she muttered. "And the generator won't kick in. I knew I should have replaced that thing last fall." Outside, the wind slammed against the siding like fists on a door. The animals grew restless, nervous whines, soft barks, the occasional thump of a cat leaping from a shelf. Harold could feel the tension in the air. "I'll check the furnace," he said, already pulling on his coat. Connie limped after him, wincing. "I'll come with." "You won't," Harold said gently. "That ankle of yours hasn't healed, and someone needs to stay with the animals." The shelter's old propane heater sputtered, groaned, then gave a final, ominous rattle. The building grew colder by the minute. Water bowls began to crust with ice. Harold moved quickly, organizing crates into the front room where the fireplace still gave off faint warmth. He stacked blankets, turned on battery lanterns, and gently moved the older dogs closer to the heat. Bear followed his every step, calm but alert. "I know, old boy," Harold said. "We've got work to do." When he stepped outside, the wind nearly knocked him back. Snow came in thick sheets, swirling and biting. He tightened his scarf and trudged to the storage shed and back, his flashlight barely cutting through the white. He hauled in firewood, armful by armful, his boots slipping on the ice. By the time he returned, he was soaked through and breathless. Inside, the room was aglow with soft light and quieter now, animals curled in blankets, cats tucked into boxes lined with towels. Socks was snuggled beside Franklin, who snored like an old harmonica. Bear lay near the hearth, his large body curled protectively around two shivering mutts. Connie watched from her chair, a warm cup of tea in hand. Her eyes shimmered. "You saved them, Harold." He didn't answer at first. Just stood there, steam rising from his coat, heart pounding not with effort, but with something deeper. He looked around at the room, at the warmth amidst the storm, and said softly, "I think they saved me too." Outside, the storm howled louder. But inside, there was peace, a fragile, glowing kind of peace that only comes when someone chooses, in the face of fear, to show up anyway. When the snow finally melted and the power was restored, life at Pine Valley returned to its usual gentle pace, but something in Harold had changed. He still arrived each morning just after sunrise, boots crunching on gravel, thermos in hand. But now he carried more than coffee. He brought purpose, warmth, belonging. The shelter hosted its spring adoption fair a few weeks later. The sun was out, music played from a crackling speaker, and children darted between kennels with paper balloons tied to their wrists. One by one, the animals found their homes. Franklin, the soulful beagle, went home with a retired choir teacher who claimed she needed someone to sing harmony. Maggie, the golden retriever, bounded off with a family of 3 kids and a backyard full of dreams. Bear stayed behind. Several visitors admired him, his noble face, his calm demeanor, but Bear made no move toward anyone. He waited at the fence until Harold knelt beside him and scratched behind his ear. "You're not going anywhere, are you?" Harold asked, smiling. Bear pressed his head into Harold's chest and let out a slow, contented sigh. A week later, Harold signed the papers. He didn't make a fuss about it. No announcement, no celebration. Just picked up Bear's leash and walked him out the front door, as if they'd been heading home together all along. At his cabin, Harold set up a soft bed beside the fireplace and chuckled as Bear promptly chose the couch instead. "I guess this place is yours now too," he murmured. On a quiet morning in June, Harold made his way up the hill to the cemetery, a small bundle of white lilies cradled in his arm and Bear trotting faithfully at his side. The grass was tall and soft underfoot, waving gently in the breeze, and the sky above was the kind of blue that made a man believe in something again. He reached Eileen's grave and stood there for a moment, letting the silence settle. Then he knelt, placed the lilies in the small vase, and brushed away a few stray pine needles from the stone. "I brought company today," he said softly. Bear sat beside him, tail curled around his paws, ears perked. Harold chuckled. "You'd have liked him. Big, quiet, stubborn as a stump. He listens better than I do, though. Doesn't interrupt." He pulled a folded note from his coat pocket and read aloud. "I'm doing all right, Eileen. I miss your voice in the mornings and your humming in the garden. But I found something, or maybe it found me. A shelter full of barking and fur and muddy footprints. A place where lost things get found again. Even old men." Bear let out a low, contented breath and rested his head on Harold's knee. As the wind swept gently through the trees, Harold looked out over the valley, sun warm on his shoulders, and whispered, "I'm not alone anymore." And in that moment, everything, grief, memory, love, and healing, folded quietly into one. A full circle. A life continuing.